Good morning. I'm married to a elementary school teacher, so as a result, I do show and tell because she tells me that she was the real teacher in the family, and so that's where we'll go. Albert James Pickett started his journey to become Alabama's first historian on the 13th day of August, 1810, in North Carolina, Anson County, North Carolina. He was the son of William Rayford Pickett and Frances Dixon Pickett. They moved to Alabama Territory in 1818, and during his formative years, young Alex was exposed to Creek Indians, the reminiscences of Indian traders, Indian countrymen, and stories from Revolutionary War veterans, both patriots and Tories. These stories made a very deep impression on this young man at 8, 10, 12, 14 years of age, and he had the opportunity to attend Creek green corn dances and to listen to more and more tales. His father, Colonel William Rayford Pickett, became a very successful businessman. And one of his first business ventures was to open a trading house near Autaugaville in Autauga County. And there, of course, he hosted Creek Indians and traders and other folks. And again, young Albert soaked up the social and cultural milieu of this area. And he made a deep impression on him as Alabama's first historian. His father served 13 years in the Alabama House and Senate. He was three times a presidential elector and a Jacksonian Democrat. And according to Pickett, that was the only kind of Democrat to be, a Jacksonian Democrat. In addition to his family, his journey was influenced by three other factors. One, his education. He was educated in the field schools of Autauga County, and from those field schools, he journeyed up to the east. Initially, he was going to a military and science school in Connecticut, but when he got there, he found out the former director of the U.S. Military Academy had had a falling out with the directors of the school. So he decided to travel a little further south to a little place called Cambridge, where he contemplated enrolling at Harvard College. But somewhere along the line, he received a letter from his father saying, no, you're going to go to Harwood Academy in Suffolk County, Virginia. And that's where he spent 2 years. There, he again was exposed to a very classical education, a heavy concentration of history and literature, philosophy, reading. He returned to Alabama in 1830 and began studying law under his brother, William Dixon Pickett. He never practiced law, but his experience working for his brother, who was a judge of the 6th Judicial Circuit in Montgomery, exposed him to courtroom procedure, document analysis, legal discovery, interviewing witnesses, writing depositions, very important skills that would support his quest into history of Alabama. His legal study exposed him to the hustle and bustle of Montgomery and its newspapers that began to accept his articles that he was writing under the pseudonym. The Planters Gazette, the Alabama Journal. In a 15-year period from about 1832 to about 1847, he produced dozens, literally dozens of articles, political commentary, social commentary, economic commentary, and some of those were eventually published as pamphlets that gained him even more exposure. The third turning point for every young man was when he made the decision to marry. At the age of 22, in 1832, he married Sarah Harris of Montgomery County. Sarah was 16 years old when they married on the 20th day of March in 1832. They spent their young life together either on her dowry lands of Forest Farm or in Montgomery. And in fact, by 1837, they were either in Montgomery or at Forest Farm. Pickett's writing began to gain him attention statewide in Alabama. He developed contacts not only with newspaper editors, but also politicians, businessmen, legislators, community leaders. His intellectual curiosity, this is our man here. His son-in-law, Colonel Michael Leonard Wood, said he stood 5'9", 175 pounds, and was a very fine man. This image appears in the first reprint of his history, published in 1896 by another son-in-law by the name of Robert Carter Randolph. His intellectual curiosity transformed him into a dedicated bibliophile. He began building a great library, particularly between about 1847 and 48. He began to correspond with international book dealers in New York City, Bartlett and Welford. John Bartlett and Charles Welford were one of the most prominent book dealers in the nation at that time. Another one was George Templeman in Washington, D.C. And from these two major international book dealers, he purchased hundreds of books. About 60 of those books you can see here at the Alabama Department of Archives in history as the Pickett Book Collection. Most of the books that he purchased were journals, travel accounts, memoirs. Most of them were written in French, a language he did not read, which was sort of a handicap, as you might guess. So he hired a translator when he got deep into writing his history. He also received a series of books and publications and papers from a large audience of correspondents. In fact, in the introduction to his book, he dedicates this book to 32 people. He could have probably dedicated it to 132 people because of their assistance in writing his history of Alabama. And from these people, he received some very important original sources. While he's engaged in this extensive correspondence and receiving these research items, he began to contemplate a trip, and he makes a trip to New Orleans in February of 1847. And this trip tremendously influenced the trajectory of his history. He made some very critical contacts with at least 4, maybe 6 very prominent Louisianians who would help him in writing his history. When he returned to Montgomery, he began to submit a series of articles to the Alabama Journal. As these newspaper articles came out, he started sending them to his correspondents, asking for feedback on his writing and his commentary. After about 5 or 6 articles that were published, he published a pamphlet, 8 Days in New Orleans, in February of 1847, and began to send the pamphlet to his correspondents, asking for feedback on his writing. And he got that feedback. He got it from very prominent local and state and national historians. One of the first was John Wesley Monette, the most prolific Mississippi historian of the antebellum period. He wrote a history of the discovery and Settlement of the Valley of the Mississippi, 2 volumes published in 1846. And he advised Pickett to start writing using a large blank notebook and using subheadings and order his events in chronological order and leaving space so as he acquired more information, he could go back and fill in those spaces with additional information. Pickett took this advice. He filled 8 of these large notebooks. 5 of them you can see here in the Alabama archives. A second important correspondent and advisor was William Gilmore Simms, the South's most prolific writer, who wrote a history of South Carolina published in 1840. This is the man that Pickett most wanted to emulate. He becomes Pickett's muse, if you will, and they exchange at least 12 letters that I've read between 1847 and December of 1850. And Simms advised Pickett on all manners of things. Pickett wanted to know about his writing style. He wanted to know about organization, punctuation, structure. And Simms replied and told him he needed to come to South Carolina so they could sit down and visit about these issues. Pickett never made it to South Carolina, but he did take some advice from Simms. One of the things that Simms told him is to write on lined paper only on one side, because that's what printers or publishers wanted. I don't think you can get very many manuscripts published today if you provide a handwritten manuscript. Another piece of advice that Simms gave to Pickett, which Pickett did not take, was he told Pickett that Alabama only needed a 1-volume history. And of course, Pickett ends up writing 2 volumes. Another important correspondent and advisor was Charles Gaillard, the Creole historian of Louisiana, who wrote numerous volumes on the history of Louisiana. The first 1 or 2 were in fact published in French. And at one point, the person who could not read French, Pickett, talked about editing that first Louisiana history, which he never did, of course. Gaillard became one of Pickett's most important correspondents and a friend until Pickett's death. Another influence was William Bacon Stevens, the professor of Bella's Letters at the University of Georgia and the author of a 2-volume history of Georgia. The first was published in 1847, the second in 1859. Stevens told Pickett to collect all the documents and information he could collect from Cabeza de Vaca up to the present time, and not to start writing until he had all this information. Well, if Pickett had followed that advice, he had never gotten around to writing, I'm afraid. The most important person next to Monette and maybe Simms was Jared Sparks. He was the McLean Professor of Ancient and Modern History at Harvard College and one of the most prolific historians of the day. He published over 40-something volumes, a life of George Washington, a life of Benjamin Franklin, in fact, the papers of Benjamin Franklin. And he provided Pickett with a beginner seminar on primary sources for writing his history of Alabama. And he specifically talked about beginning with the explorations of Hernando de Soto, going through the French explorations and settlement of the Gulf in Mobile and Louisiana. Writing from Cambridge in November of 1847, he specifically told Pickett that he should concentrate on the gentleman of Elvas's account of De Soto's expedition and not rely on that of Garcilaso de la Vega, an account that he said was sheer romance from beginning to end. Again, Pickett relied a little more on Garcilaso de Vega than the Gentleman of Elvas. In 1850, Pickett had received increased recognition for his newspaper articles and for 2 pamphlets. One on the 8 days in New Orleans in February 1847, and a second one entitled The Arrest of Aaron Burr in Alabama in 1807, which becomes chapter 29 in volume 2 of his 2-volume History of Alabama. But the most important pamphlet came out in late 1849. It was titled The Invasion of the Territory of Alabama by 1,000 Spaniards under Ferdinand de Soto in 1540. Before this becomes chapter 1, Pickett corrects de Soto's first name and gets to Hernando. Another important person in Pickett's journey was a lawyer from New Orleans by the name of Alfred Hennon. He was a Yale graduate, a professor of constitutional law, and he sent Pickett primary letters written by Alexander McGillivray and a copy of a secret treaty between Alexander McGillivray and George Washington. One of 3 copies of that particular secret articles of the Treaty of New York, 1790. Pickett becomes the first person to write significantly about Alexander McGillivray. Another important person was John Francis Hamtramck Claiborne. He's known as the father of Mississippi history, but his most important role in regards to Pickett was that he supplied Pickett with his father's military papers. His father was General Ferdinand Lee Claiborne, who commanded the Mississippi Militia, the Mississippi Territorial Militia, during the Creek War of 1813-14. Pickett's letters to his correspondents included fairly specific questions regarding people, places, and events, such as the Red Creek Red Sticks, the Battle of Burnt Corn Creek, the Siege of Fort Mims, Sam Dale's canoe fight, Andrew Ellicott's line, early settlements and Spanish occupation. He organized all this material, and again, you can see almost all of these letters here in the archives. He organized them in the following way. Letters from various distinguished and well-informed persons, answering inquiries made of them by Albert J. Pickett of Montgomery in relation to his history of Alabama. In addition to his voluminous correspondence, he also conducted oral interviews of very prominent early Alabama settlers, military leaders, and people with particular information. 2 of these people he interviewed between June of 1847 and the spring of 1848. Excuse me, my seasonal allergies have taken hold of me. Pickett made at least 3 trips during this period to Mobile and to Baldwin County when he interviewed Dr. Thomas G. Holmes, survivor of the Fort Mims siege, and George Strother Gaines, the factor of the Choctaw Trading House. These 2 men provided him firsthand information, which he labeled in this manner, and this is one of the things he continued to do. Notes taken from the lips of Dr. Thomas G. Holmes, or notes taken from the lips of Mr. George S. Gaines. This was his standard procedure. Pickett described his interviews that he employed to glean this oral history of Alabama in the following way. I have taken many of the following notes down on paper in a great hurry, as fast as people narrating would speak, and there are many mistakes in grammar, spelling, and general arrangement. I wrote under many disadvantages, frequently surrounded by intrusive people asking idle questions, often writing in fields, in swamps, on my knees, wherever I had an opportunity of meeting persons I desired to obtain information from. I have traveled much over South Alabama to complete my stock of historical information and was about 12 months engaged in it. That becomes a criticism, as many of you know. By Christmas of 1850, Pickett had completed the writing of his history and finalized his travel plans to New York City, where he had identified an engraver by the name of John William Orr. There he stayed from about mid-February to the latter part of March, while Orr executed his engravings and maps. He used these engravings that were based on the watercolors of the French artist Jacob Lemoyne to discuss the Timucua Indians encountered by De Soto and other early explorers in Florida and Georgia. He uses 6 of these illustrations that were done by Orr in his book, and he references another 20 of the illustrations. They all came from the second volume of Travels published by Theodore de Bry in 1591. Lemoyne had planned to publish his own travel account, but he died in 1587, and his widow sold his watercolors to Theodore de Bry, an engraver and publisher who eventually, he and his sons eventually published 12 volumes of travels to America, and volume 2 included some 43 of Lemoyne's watercolors, or at least watercolors attributed to Lemoyne. In addition to, and all of these appear in volume 1, along with other illustrations. In addition, he had some maps produced, or plats produced. This particular map is a fold-out. It was engraved by a lithographer by the name of Saroni. In fact, his firm was Saroni and Major, and they were also in New York City. This is a plat of Fort Mims, and you probably can't read it, but it came from the Claiborne Papers. It was the first time that anyone had seen this plat when it was published in Pickett's history in 1851. This is a plat of the Battle of Talladega, and here is another of Horseshoe Bend. I'm not sure of the origin of these two plats. I think probably Pickett acquired them when he visited Andrew Jackson at the Hermitage in 1837. He and Sarah, a 9-month-old daughter, and Sarah's sister, traveled to Hot Springs, North Carolina. And from Hot Springs, North Carolina, they traveled across country through the mountains to Nashville. And they ended up spending 3 days with Rachel and Andrew Jackson. So these either came from Jackson directly or from his right-hand man, John. Once he had completed his illustrations for his history, and he probably found Orr through John Wesley Monette, who had published with Harper Brothers in New York City and had used Orr in his illustrations. He traveled to Charleston, South Carolina, arrived there about the 22nd day of March, 1851, where he worked with a printer by the name of Walker and James. And there's no wild guess as to how he found Walker and James. William Gilmore Simms. In a letter to his wife, Sarah, on the 5th day of May, 1851, he announced the completion of Volume 1 of his history, which he referred to as the hardest work of my life, close quote. The printing of the 2-volume history had been completed by early July, but the first copies don't show up in Alabama until September of 1851. There, they were available at 2 bookstores in Montgomery, and the 2 volumes would cost you $3, and they were wildly purchased A banker in Huntsville purchased 400 copies to sell in the Huntsville and Tennessee River Valley to friends and associates. A planter in Autauga County purchased 12 copies to give to his children. And of course, the Governor Collier, got the legislature to appropriate a huge amount of money to send copies of Pickett to libraries in the nation. $150. Huge sum. My third edition, by the way, Pickett's history went through 3 editions between July and December of 1851. It was a tremendous success. My third edition cost me $200, 200 times what it was selling for in Montgomery in September of 1851. Unlike the brief newspaper reviews that were published about this history, DeBow's Review in New Orleans and the Southern Quarterly Review in Charleston published in-depth reviews of Pickett's history. But even before those were published, 3 literary journals in New York City published reviews. In fact, the International Monthly Magazine published the first review of Pickett's history in July. Somehow, the International Monthly Magazine got a copy of Volume 1 and produced a review in July of 1851. Later, the Literary World, in November of 1851, published a very positive review, followed by the Knickerbocker in December of 1851. Generally very complimentary reviews. In fact, one of the biggest compliments came from the fact that Pickett had spent 20 pages of his manuscript on Aaron Burr, which was a criticism later on. One of the comments was that they were surprised to see that there was a quality book printer in the South. Sort of like William James's comments, he didn't know anyone in the South could read, but that's okay too. James Dunwoody Brunson DeBow, J.D.B. DeBow, was the editor of DeBow's Review in New Orleans. He published a 27-page review of Pickett's new 2-volume history. And although he did not think it was a great literary masterpiece, he complimented Pickett on producing a worthwhile history of minute and truthful narrative with a simplicity of style and predicting it will be a permanent text. But DeBow was not happy with Pickett. He had a tremendous issue that Pickett had stopped his history in 1820 with William Wyatt Bibb's administration. And he urged Pickett to publish a 3rd volume, bringing Alabama up to date in regards to its commerce, its manufacturing, its intellectual progress. And as most of you know, DeBow was a very big promoter of the South and wanted to counteract the negative publicity coming out of northern presses. So he used 27 pages to write about Pickett, but he didn't really think it was a great masterpiece. Another review, another 27-page review, was produced by William Gilmore Simms in the Southern Quarterly Review. He used the January issue 1852 of the Southern Quarterly Review. He doesn't mention Pickett's name until the 9th page. He talks about a history by Meek, Alexander Beaufort Meek. Meek and Simms were correspondents. Meek was one of Pickett's nemesis and critics. In fact, he wrote Simms that he didn't think Pickett had the ability to complete a history of Alabama. Pickett showed him that he did, and if you look for a copy of Meek's history of Alabama, you have to come to the Alabama archives because its 800 plus manuscript is here. It was never published. The primary compliment that Sims gives Pickett, it comes in a letter actually that he wrote in June of 1851 to the former governor of South Carolina, James Henry Hammond. And he told Hammond, "By the way, you could be well printed and sent forth in this city. Walker and James have accumulated all the means and appliances for good work. They are now doing a history of Alabama by Pickett, one of the prettiest specimens of bookmaking ever done in America." Despite some inaccuracies, some writing style peccadillos, digressions, over-reliance on single sources, most modern historians still hold Pickett in high regard. John W. Coggy, in his masterpiece on McGilvery in 1938, complimented Pickett for writing the first serious information about Alexander McGilvery. Pickett's biographer, the late Frank Lawrence Owsley Jr., complimented Pickett on his research methods, his evaluation of available sources, and his careful source citation, all showing that Pickett had developed as a good historian. But probably the most complimentary review of Pickett came in March of 1983 from Alabama's most consequential writer in the 20th century. A little lady by the name of Nell Harper Lee delivered a paper, Romance and High Adventure, at the Alabama History and Heritage Festival in Eufaula. She praised his long digressions, describing the native population in the region between DeSoto and the French presence in the Gulf South, saying for this alone, Pickett deserved a place in American literature. She closed by calling Pickett's work a unique treasure, one that should be found in every high school library in Alabama. Others, Leah Rawls Atkins, writing in Alabama, The History of the Deep South State, one of the best, if not the best, one-volume history of our state, called Pickett the most complimented Pickett on being the writer who made the most historical contribution to Alabama in the antebellum period. And she says it remains a valuable work. Michael O'Brien, an intellectual historian at Cambridge University in England, wrote 2 penetrating articles about writers in the antebellum South who were influenced by Southern Romanticism, which he called the historicist narrative. And he claimed that Pickett, John Wesley Monette, and Charles Gaillard demonstrated an understanding of the layered effect of history before the writers on the Atlantic seaboard. And he really complimented Pickett for losing his Anglo-Saxon prejudices and concentrate on the European influence on Alabama from the Gulf, the French, the Spanish, and the British. More recent scholars have been a little more critical, and I'm running out of time and I'm going to cut this short. They feel like Pickett wrote more about heroes, villains, bloody encounters, social political tragedy. One of these critics claimed that although Pickett included all types of people within a slave society, this writer accuses him of obscuring causes, focusing on heroic individuals, and highlighting his narrative with bloody, action-packed drama, the very thing that Harper Lee complimented him for. More recently, in the finest one-volume study of the Creek War, Gregory Wasikoff, in his A Conquering Spirit, Fort Mims and the Red Stick War of 1813-1814, writes, Pickett's account of the Red Stick War is primarily oral history. His notes from interviews with Thomas G. Holmes, Jeremiah Austell, Abraham, Mordecai, and many other careful observers form the evidentiary evidence for his book's 100 pages on the Red Stick War, and they remain key resources today. And I think we can all agree that Pickett's history remains a relevant study of Alabama's protohistoric, colonial, territorial, and early foundations as a state. And his work has been cited repeatedly by prominent writers, authors, and hopefully they're now using this edition of Pickett's history, which has Pickett's narrative in the middle and my notes on the side, trying to correct some things and elucidate on other issues that Pickett wrote on. And I'll be glad to respond to any questions at this time. Yes, sir.
You mentioned another historian, Meeks, who had written a history of Alabama that was never published.
Alexander Beaufort Meeks. He wrote the long poem on William Weatherford.
Did you intend to ever do an annotated version of his book?
No, sir. At my age, I have 4 manuscripts, and one of my wife's threatened to shoot me over or divorce me if I don't get it published. So I'm going to stay away from Meek. But it is interesting, and Meek was a very literary man. He had a journal in a literary journal in Tuscaloosa that he edited, and it folded after 6 issues. And he ends up in Mobile. And in fact, he becomes an assistant or associate editor of the Mobile Register, which was one of the primary critics of Pickett's history and Pickett's work. So, anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned, I think that there were 8 notebooks that Pickett held, but 5 of which you can see here. Did I have my numbers right?
Yes, ma'am.
You don't have all. What do you know about the other notebooks that aren't?
I don't, and I cut my comments about Pickett short. After the publication of his history, of course, he dies at 48 of probably a pulmonary edema on the 28th day of October in 1848. He had been planning, after publishing this history, he planned to write a history of the Southwest. And we know from his son-in-law, Colonel Michael Leonard Woods, that manuscript was out there. One of the newspapers, J.J. Hooper's newspaper, which just won't stay on my brain right now, announced that Pickett had completed at least 2/3 of that manuscript. Michael Leonard Woods, in his reminiscences of Colonel Albert James Pickett, says he had completed 3/4 of that manuscript. In my research here and elsewhere, I found a reference that said that there was a manuscript out there, and that his wife, who ends up living in Montgomery to her death in July of 1894, had loaned that manuscript to someone in 1879, and that person's name escapes me. I think I have it in one of my notes, marginal notes. But he went to Texas in the winter of 1856-57. He didn't buy land, but he was very impressed with Texas, came back and began to worry about his health. He made a trip to Pensacola in the summer or spring of 1857 and wrote a series of letters to the Alabama Journal and other publications that were published about the history of Pensacola. And then in the spring of 1858, he goes to Bladen Springs in what would become Choctaw County. He spent several weeks there in that resort, taking the baths. And then he and Colonel Woods journeyed back down to Mobile, and the Mobile Register announced that he was going to Point Clear to enjoy the breezes. And from Point Clear, he returns back to Montgomery and dies in October of 1858. Before he died, he bought a house here in Montgomery, the Phi House, which is the Phi Pickett House today, and is the headquarters of the Montgomery Historical Society. He was buried originally at the family cemetery at Forest Farm, but he was exhumed following his wife's death and was buried beside her in Oakwood Cemetery. Yes, sir.
And what is the problem with Pickett and the Mobile Press that you alluded to earlier?
Well, the Mobile Register announced that when they heard that Pickett was going to write a history of Alabama, they announced that they preferred their local citizen A.B. Meek's history over one that might be produced by Pickett. Now, this is before Pickett's history is even completed or written. So there was a prejudice, and there are a couple of very biting and sarcastic letters that Meek writes to William Gilmore Simms, in which he questions Pickett's ability first to write a history. He questions his ability to write, I think, but in fact, he questions his ability to complete a history of Alabama that would be worth of any value.
2 questions.
Yes, sir.
What surprised you the most from your research?
The vastness of his research enterprise, his effort at getting at the truth, although sometimes in the interest of keeping the reader's interest, he fudges a little bit on the truth. But if you read carefully his history, and which I believe I have done, and then come back and document how he came to some of these conclusions, he's pretty accurate. The greatest problem that Pickett ran into was he didn't have a research library, only his own. He didn't have an archives to consort. So a lot of what he writes is based on one primary source. And for example, he gets the spelling of a couple of people's names wrong. And one of them is the heading of a chapter. In fact, 2 of them are heading of the chapters that he writes about. And so he didn't have another source to correct some of the things he was taking from eyewitness accounts and from the testimony that he received in letters and documents. So, but I was just impressed with the breadth of his research. He announced his intent to write the history in March of 1847, but I think he had made up his mind to start to write a history as early as 1845. Pickett had 2 political experiences. He comes off with the honorific title of colonel. He served as Clement Comer Clay's aide-de-camp during the Creek War of 1836. And he learned an abundance of information about military tactics and strategy. He wrote advertisements for supplies for the Army and the military. And Clay was roundly criticized for not expunging the creeks much earlier. Then he becomes a bank inspector under Governor Benjamin Fitzpatrick. And there was great criticism of the State Bank of Alabama, and it was going out of business. And he saw all the criticism that Fitzpatrick was getting and others were getting. And I think he just got turned off by politics. And I think that's why he stops his history in 1820. Now, a couple of his modern critics, Philip Beidler and Joanna Shields, they say it's because he doesn't want to deal with the issue of slavery, and he wants to skirt the issue of slavery. That may have been a part of it, but that was not the biggest part of it. I don't think he wanted to get into politics, because if you look at the chapter 42, I think it is, he does all these biographical sketches of people right up to the 40s. So I'm not sure he was doing that. But he wrote 2 jury reports in 1835 and 1845, which he was advocating the closing of the slave trade, or bringing slaves into Alabama. And he's roundly criticized for that, and especially the jury report of 1835. Both of those, by the way, were printed as pamphlets. He was bothered by Turner's revolt in Virginia, and he was concerned that external influences might generate some kind of slave revolt in Alabama. He was accused of trying to prevent people from rising up and becoming slaveholders. I don't think that was his point. Yes, sir.
Where was he living when he wrote most of his material?
He and Sarah either purchased or rented a cottage at Robinson Springs. And so everything that I've been able to discern was he did the bulk of his writing at Robinson Springs. He went to Robinson Springs with those 8 large notebooks, and from those large notebooks he gleaned his history, which he had completed by Christmas time of 1850. So on the other hand, someone, yes, sir.
Did Pickett have any interaction with
L.C. Draper?
Yes.
No, not that I know of. I never ran across that. I don't believe I did. I don't remember that. Draper's primary work, Draper was in Pontotoc, Mississippi for a while, and then he ends up in Wisconsin. And the bulk of Draper's work starts about 1845 and comes forward. And that develops the so-called Draper manuscripts that are part of the Wisconsin Historical Collection. So I don't recall that. Don't hold me completely, but I don't think so. I think if he, gosh, that's a good question. I think if he had dealt with Draper, it would have jumped out, especially if Draper had responded. Most of the correspondence that are in the Pickett papers here are letters he received, not a great number of his letters that went out. In fact, in his correspondence with Sims, I found more letters that he wrote to Sims in Sims printed papers than I found here in the archives. Yes, ma'am.
The errors that you noted where he fudged history a little bit, did you correct all those?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so
Yes.
besides that, then you've got correct.
The marginal notes correct, expand, provide a little more elucidation about what he was talking about. Like a lot of local and state historians in the mid to late 19th century, he used a lot of last names, which is an indication that he was picking up some of this in sources that were only from one person. So one of the things I tried to do was give some background to some of these people. The chapter on Boudreaux is a classic example. He used a really great primary source to write that chapter, but he got the name spelled wrong, and it's spelled wrong in his one source, which was a primary source. So, and then there was an incident in Clark County where a local hero saved a woman at a fort, I think Fort Sinqueville, and he has the man's name was Hayden, Hayden. Well, he had 2 sources on Hayden's escapade. One of them spelled his name Haden, and right now the other one won't come to me. But the man's name was Hydn, but he didn't have that because his two sources didn't spell the name correctly. And of course, he couldn't or didn't interview Hayden about this incident. So those are some of the examples. Go ahead. This lady right here has a story to tell. She has a diamond ring on her left, is that left? Yeah. Hand that belonged to Sarah Harris Pickett. So, and I got to see that. Yes, ma'am, your question.
No question, I just wanted to say that, and that I'm from Knoxville, next to Pickett Home, 6 miles from Pickett Home all my life. Once the home is gone, but I remember it well.
The Pickett home in Autaugaville. When Pickett died in 1858, he owned 2,600 acres in Autauga County. About a little over 1,000 acres were under cultivation. The rest was woodlands. The Forest Farm was 1,900 acres, about 1,100 or 1,200 acres under cultivation. He was pretty much a scientific farmer, a very successful farmer. I can't remember if it's the Alabama Journal, but one of the Montgomery papers in 1846 declared that Pickett had the finest dairy in Montgomery County, that it was producing $850 annually. And I'm not a math person, but if you can figure the inflation rate in today's money, it gives you an idea. When the 1860 census comes out, Sarah has real property valued at $193,000. She has personal property, slaves, valued at $175,000. So Pickett was a very, very successful planter, a scientific farmer. He wrote a letter to Sarah from Charleston saying he was worried about the slaves having enough bacon, that he wanted to make sure they had enough food. And Sarah, like a good wife, replied, "You left me in charge, and I've taken care of the bacon." That's almost the tone in that letter. It's really good. He was a voluminous writer. Sarah gave birth to 12 children, 9 survived to adulthood. When he went to Texas in the winter of 56-57, he wrote each of those children letters, the ones that were up of any age. He did the same thing when he was in Charleston, getting his book published. The letters are just really fascinating, and I found myself spending too much time reading things I already knew about when I was doing research here. But they're fascinating. He was something. Richard T. Bagby was a chemist and geologist. I think he was Alabama's first geologist. He was at the University of Alabama. And he writes Pickett 2 really interesting letters that are here in the archives. And he was wanting to counter the cotton production and the cotton culture in Alabama. And he wanted Pickett's help in trying to promote rice culture. And I'm not really sure how he pigeonholed Pickett, although Pickett had written articles about farming. In fact, he wrote a 3-part article on Redlands farming, which was part of his land, the Forest Farm. But his father, as I found out, raised about 100 acres of rice. And as I found out more, Pickett raised maybe 200 acres of rice. I mean, this is in central Alabama. And there is one claim that Forest Farm was completely self-sufficient down to producing the clothing that the slaves wore. So that's the kind of agrarian, cutting-edge farmer that he was, and obviously had very fine help in a slave population. By the way, when that 1860 census comes out, there are 94 slaves at Forest Farm and 68 slaves in the Autauga lands. Pickett died intestate. He didn't have a will. So those were reported in that way. Yes, sir.
I'm still trying to formulate my question, so apologies if I stumble. But a personal interest of mine are the peripheries, historical peripheries, so frontiers and borderlands. And it seems that in current scholarship, there's a renewed interest in the South in its frontier period.
Yes, I think you're right. Yes.
It was the West.
Yes, it was the West. It was the Southwest.
Daniel Dupre's book is the most recent one I've read. I'm not by any means a scholar. But to what extent did Pickett, if at all, think of himself as being on the frontier? How did that affect his writing? Because these different historians seem to conceive of themselves very regionally. There doesn't seem to be much, I hate to say broad, but
Right. Well, I think Michael O'Brien in those two articles kind of go to the subject you're asking in regards to the frontier aspects and whether Pickett or Monet or Gaillard. I think they all understood that they were products not of the English on the seaboard, but more were products. Although Pickett's born in Anson County, North Carolina, he has a different view of Alabama's development. I mean, I believe, and somebody can correct me, I think he's the first historian who gives DeSoto credit for discovering Alabama. So, so yeah, I think he did, and that was one of the reasons he decided to start writing the history of the Southwest. I think he wanted to take his interest, his intellectual curiosity into the development of the Trans-Mississippi West and who influenced the development of that Trans-Mississippi West, and thus the trip to Texas in the winter of 56, 57. I've seen a couple of people who claim that he was just going there to find land and move his slaves to Texas. I don't think that's the story. And if you read carefully some of his letters, I don't believe that was his intent. He had a brother-in-law, Mosley, who had been the owner of the Alabama Journal, and that's why he got some of his articles published there in the 1820s and 30s. But that brother-in-law had moved to Texas and had written him about the great opportunities in Texas, and that's one of the reasons I think that brought him there. But also, he still had not given up on his idea of writing a history of the Southwest, and so I think that was another reason for that journey. Yes.
Jim, this is a side note to what's been a very fine presentation, and I appreciate that. But I'm wondering if you've been in touch with this woman who was in Montgomery some months ago, who is a descendant of Pickett, and she was here with a woman who's a descendant of one of Pickett's slaves, and they were doing companion research.
Right, I got to speak to her. She was there when I addressed a group at the Herring bookstore. And the theory of the lady who is a descendant of a Pickett slave was that her descendant was kidnapped, in Iowa, in Free Territory, by Pickett and brought to Alabama and made a slave. And so she was asking me if I had delved into the slave population of the source. And so I referred her to Pickett's jury reports of 1835 and 1845. And I don't know when Pickett would have time to go up to Iowa and kidnap slaves or kidnap African Americans. But she claims that Wilson Pickett was a descendant of the Pickett slaves from Forest Farm, and that's probably quite possible and true. But she was trying to connect some dots, and I tried to dissuade her of one of those connections. I didn't, and I will not declare here that I've read every letter Pickett ever wrote, but I read almost every letter that he did write that's in this archive, and also some of the letters that are printed in other people's collection, like William Gilmore Sims's printed papers, and also the letters he received. And there's almost no mention of slaves. And one of the, I think it's Joanna Nicole Shields, one of her criticisms that he doesn't deal with slave controversies and whatever. But of course, the great regional division of slavery comes after the date of his history, or where he brings his history to. But he does talk about slaves, and two or three of the heroes he names, and they're African Americans. One is Paro, who was one of Alexander McGilvery's right-hand men. And when the Spanish took over West Florida, a large number of the settlers in Natchez were New Englanders. They were a part of the Connecticut Military Company, and they had received land grants. In fact, two of their members went to England and received direct land grants from George III. So they led a rather large contingent of New Englanders along the Atlantic into the Gulf and up the Mississippi and the Big Black River, and settled in the Natchez area from the Yazoo to the mouth of the Big Black. When the Spanish take over, they're concerned about what's going to happen to their land grants, and some of them were denied. As a result, a large contingent of these New Englanders go across country, and they're intercepted by Creek Indians in what is now east central Alabama. And they're not sure what's going to happen to them, and the Indians want to know, why are you doing here? What are you doing here? Where are you going? Paro happens to be there, and he intercedes for these New Englanders, and he questions the New Englanders, and the New Englanders produce a document. And whether Paro could read or not, he read the letter to the Creek Indians, which and said, these people are innocent, they're just trying to go home, and they should be given free passage and allowed to move on. One of the things that went on while we had this European struggle over the Gulf, governors, military commanders gave passes, like passports, visas. And so these Creeks were wanting to know, well, where's your paperwork showing that you have a right to cross our land? So that's what that came to. Dale's canoe fight. When Sam Dale, Jeremiah Austell, and those folks in the Tensaw encounter this small Creek war party in canoes, Dale then gets out there and battles with them, and he's given credit for killing 6 or whatever. Well, guess who pulls the two canoes together so that Dale can slay those Creeks? A free slave, a free black man by the name of Caesar. And as best we know, Caesar was free. He ends up in Kemper County, Mississippi, and I think Sam Dale's the one that takes him there, and in Kemper County, Mississippi, he's listed as a slave. But Pickett gives him credit because of his strength of pulling those canoes together, which allowed Dale to slaughter those Creeks and become this bigger-than-life hero. There's another one, and it has to do, and this slave is not named, but Pickett goes into this story about how he saved a group that were traveling into the Gulf South. So perhaps he was trying to skirt the issue of slavery. And one of these critics says that he was only writing for white readers. I'm not sure that's true, but anyone who could read his history. Other questions? Thank you. You've been a great audience, and you listened to great questions. And like that legislator and banker in Huntsville, if you want to buy 400 copies, I'll stay here and sign all of them.
Thank you all for coming. We look forward to seeing you again. We do have an
wanted to do a special exhibit, so we pulled a few pieces from Pickett's history, a couple letters, and one of those manuscript books, so it's right outside the lobby. Thank you for coming. Look forward to seeing you again.